Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I'm Gemma Files, and this is, of course, No
No
Darkness
darkness,
But
but
Ours.
us. I think we
Um,
actually managed to we're actually in sync there for once. Although it never quite comes out that way when when I play it back. Um, Today we've got a special edition of the podcast. As you may remember from the previous podcast, we were discussing queer horror. And so on the heels of that, we're having a special edition here with our guest, Hailey Piper, author of The Worm and His Kings and many other
Queen of
many
Teeth.
other stories. Queen of Teeth, The Possession of Natalie Glasgow, No Gods for Drowning, Your Mind is a Terrible Thing, and the
Mhm.
upcoming A Light Most Hateful. I'm getting exhausted just reading a list of your credits.
Sorry.
You're, hey, no, it's cool. I mean, we enjoy reading them, so it's great. Um,
Seriously.
so yeah, this is, as I say, this kind of follows on from what we were talking about queer horror, and I thought anyone whose Twitter bio opens with the line "Make horror gay as fuck" clearly has to. We clearly have to talk to that person anyway.
Exactly.
So, I don't know, Haley, for anyone who's maybe not encountered your work before, do you want to give a very brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Hailey Piper. As Simon and Gemma were saying, I write books. I write queer horror. I try to. My books are a lot about wonder, weirdness, empathy, and queerness. Yeah, you kind of listed all the books. So I've had short stories in Vestarian, Pseudopod, Cosmic Horror Monthly, a bunch of places. Yeah, I mean, I live in the U.S. in Maryland. I think that's about it.
Okay, well, so let's see, we've been just looking at the
So,
various questions we were sort of trying to come up with for. Do you want to start, Gemma, or?
um, I I think I will ask. I mean, it's always like, are you asking something, or are you just, you know, making a statement, going yes, no?
This is more of a
Um,
comment than a question.
Well, I don't quite want to go there because I left my I left my neckbeard hat somewhere. But yeah, whenever you talk about queer horror, I think to some degree you're talking about the juxtaposition of authorial identity, uh, not quite versus content, but authorial identity and content. So, for example, I've written what a lot of people might call queer horror. I don't myself identify as queer per se, um, and or queerish. I called myself at one point recently. But it's hard to do that when it's like, no, yeah, you're right, I am a cis married lady with a kid and da da da, so what are those two things separate for you, or are they completely consistently entwined, identity and content?
um, I think it has to be entwined just because that's how I see the world.
Yeah.
I can't escape it. Even if I were to pretend to be escaping it, I'm not actually changing that. I'm just that just ends up being putting on a layer over it instead. That's pretending to be one thing that it's not.
Yep.
I think that's the simplest way to look at it.
Yeah.
I can't stop being queer, and so I'm going to write from my perspective. I just don't know how to do it any other way.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Good
that's the
stuff.
first thing
And
that occurred to me.
and I focus on myself in that because I don't want to speak for everyone.
Yeah.
There may be people who can step out of that.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, it's one thing that you. I remember you remember. a completely different tactic. I had to write an article about sort of attitudes to animal cruelty, and as I think I said to Gemma when I was struggling with it, it was like, every time I say we feel this way about animals, or we don't. Well, no, we don't. There's lots and lots of different perspectives. There's no single experience. Like, there are parts of the world where it would be absolutely anathema to eat dogs or cats, and other parts of the world where it's fine. Even in Europe on a micro scale with like horses. My sister, like a lot of teenage girls, went through this phase where she absolutely adored horses, and nearly broke down into floods of tears on a holiday to France when she realised that a butcher was serving horse meat. So even like two neighbouring countries, you can get these completely different perspectives. So obviously within anything, it's very hard to kind of nail down a single consistent attitude to anything, really.
Yeah, well, that's true. Although I would say that, as horror writers, I think all three of us have been more likely to write about eating human beings than to write about horses, eating horses.
Benny Rose the Cannibal King. There's another one of your books I forgot.
Anyway,
so I was gonna ask you what was, because looking at reading the stuff of yours I've read, and reading the story collection Unfortunate Elements of My Anatomy, there's very strong fantasy elements in a lot of them, and then you've got stuff like Benny Rose the Cannibal King, which seems to very much have its roots in kind of 80s gore type stuff.
Yeah.
So what was your actual route into horror, and what does horror mean for you specifically?
Like, by route, do you mean like as a kid, or like writing it, I guess? Or
I think, more writing it.
I mean, I've always written monsters and stuff, like just on a surface level, because that's what I just liked. But with that in mind, I did at one point think I was going to be a fantasy writer, like when I was younger. But everything kept turning darker whenever I would write it. It's just one of those other inescapable things. And I don't remember when it was, but at some point I was just like, I think I'm a horror writer. I mean, it seems like something that should have been obvious. It was my favorite genre to read, to watch, like to interact with. But it wasn't occurring to me that that's what I should do, even though I was already writing horror. I just wasn't calling it that. And once I, I don't know, admitted that or whatever, it just became that much easier to write because I wasn't fighting it so much, which funny enough let me have more paths into writing fantasy and science fiction stuff, because horror can infect anything. That's one of the cool things about it as a genre. You can find horror in every other genre because it's such an atmospheric thing.
Yes.
But I think, and I've said this a bunch of times, so try not. I don't want to repeat myself, but I can't help it because it's just my answer. But like, I think horror is the most honest genre, both in the sense that it doesn't have the limitations that some other genres kind of get imposed on them sometimes, like rules and rigidity, but also because on a textual level, I think characters show who they really are when they're afraid.
Yes. Yeah. I always used to say that I felt that I drifted towards it because it was the most emotionally honest genre, where you don't have to. I mean, it's a weird thing to be writing science fiction or writing fantasy, where intellectually you're completely open to anything in terms of plot, and at the same time there's this part of you that's like, oh yeah, but I don't want to get too dark because then people will disconnect with it.
I think that's the funniest thing when I see that, when they'll be reading something. This happened with a friend of mine with a story she had published, and somebody's like, I like this, but it's too dark. And it's like, well, if you liked it, then maybe it wasn't too dark.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which again brings in the element of it's interesting. So in terms of identity, whenever people talk about sexuality and identity, there is this kind of feeling of reductionism, where it's like, well, what am I, just my identity? Am I just my sexuality? Or am I a person who has many, many other facets that are all feeding into the work that I produce? And again, whenever people write something which contains eroticism, it's like, okay, well, now you've just drifted into porn, or you've just drifted into erotica. It's like, you're just like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to turn people on? It's like, in that same way that, when people talk about things being too dark, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to depress me? Are you trying to make me feel bad? And in a strange way, I kind of feel that that horror in general is like a matrix of all these emotional, these vulnerable emotional states.
Yeah, because those questions, like, are you trying to make me feel turned on? Are you trying to make me feel scared? Trying to make me feel depressed? And it's like, well, the point is, we're trying to make you feel.
Yes.
I've often thought science fiction's talked about as the literature of ideas, and horror is much more maybe the literature of emotions, or of psychology as well. To an extent, you can often get away with much more psychologically complex and divided characters than you would in like a lot of space operas or fantasy. Although this is possibly a generalization on my part, as I'm not as widely read in those genres as I am in others.
Well, I do often think that on Twitter recently, people were talking about how the Gothic is horror and romance crossing over, but people hesitate to say that because it's like, much like people thinking that horror is the intersection of gore and porno streets. The idea that the idea of it being the literature of emotions. It's like, oh, those slippery emotions.
I think that's it in a nutshell, though. It's because those emotions suggest that in a literary landscape, you're supposed to feel ashamed of liking romance and horror, and to have them compared to something that's as respected as the Gothic, acts like the Gothic should be shamed too. It's like, no, it's the opposite. We're saying that because you should look at horror and romance as regarded as highly as you do the Gothic.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So in a way, it's like the literature of connection.
Yeah.
Yes. It's like, and I was thinking, here we go back to body horror. When I think of your work, I think of body horror. And I think of things being slippery, things being malleable, things, people changing, people, and again, which is very horrifying and very erotic and very emotional, all at the same time. Again, something we were talking about on Twitter recently was the idea that body horror, that gore is about what happens to other people, and body horror is about what happens to you.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. But yeah, there's something very, there's something very, there's something that can be kind of masturbatory about body horror and kind of penetrative about gore. But really, body horror is both masturbatory and penetrative.
Yeah. And I think really, like, people say that stuff a lot of times as if that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I think with us, like, people as horror readers, it's just like, no, that's awesome.
Yes.
Like, there's nothing wrong with it being penetrative and masturbatory. There's nothing wrong with the work being indulgent or even self-indulgent.
Yes. Yeah. there's nothing more self-indulgent than a power fantasy in a lot of ways, you know, and there's nothing more self-indulgent than on the other end of the scale, not that there are actually ends to this particular scale. I think much like the spectrum, which my son is on and I'm on and you know, it actually goes around in a circle. You know, we all meet each other there. I think that, you know, that body horrors is very much about, it's not just about taking power, but it's also about giving power, and it's also about destroying yourself, you know, it's a kind of culmination, which sounds very erotic when you think about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, anyways, Simon, ask a question. Gemma, make a statement. Simon, ask a question.
It's easy to get lost talking about all the gore and monstrosity and body and such.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's really what we want these kind of discussions to be, and have people sort of like saying what they think. It's the questions are just a kind of a means to an end to get the ball rolling and go through whatever kind of tangents we feel like doing. I mean, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your process. I mean, whether you're a planner as opposed to a pantser, but also because I mean you've I mean, thinking again, going back to that first line of your Twitter bio, make horror gay as fuck. Is that kind of a mission statement for you? And how much? And is it something that's kind of a conscious goal when developing a project, or does it just happens that way because?
I'd say that make horror gay as fuck is a mission statement after something has already been written. I would say that that's more about what people are reading, what they're seeing. I don't have to make it gay when I'm doing it. It's going to be that way because I am who I am, and like I said before, I can't help. Like I can't disentangle that. I could censor myself.
Yes,
I did do that, and I did do that with the Possession of Natalie Glasgow. That was my first, thing, my first novella, and I was not sure what the landscape was. So I cut some stuff out, but I was still saying make horror gay as fuck, just not applying it necessarily to that because there's only one reference to her having a partner. And it's just at this point in the, now as the book as it is. But I don't want to do that. And as I kept writing, I didn't know how to do that. I was like, well, I'm not going to be really telling stories at this point. I'm going to be telling nothing because I'm cutting all the pieces of myself out of it.
Yes.
And that's not to say not to go with the reductionism. I don't want to say oh, well, me being gay is the only aspect of my personality that's innate. It's that's not true at all.
No, but it is pretty integral. It is pretty integral.
But it's just the concepts are also part, and that's the case with any writer. The concepts you're working with are part of you. The way you present them is part of you. Even the little details give away pieces of your perspective. Even sometimes things that the author isn't aware that they're revealing. But you start to chip away at that, and it no longer is representative of yourself anymore. Even if it's not an identity or an identity aspect, if you start chipping, it's well, I don't want to reveal that I have this point of view about, I don't know, cheese crackers or something. It can be something silly like that. But there's such a thing as well. You shouldn't probably go on a 3-page digression about cheese crackers unless it's relevant in some way.
Yep.
But there's a difference between that. There, like you said, there's a spectrum. You don't have to go all the way. It's not just one thing or another. There's degrees to this. So process-wise, I don't really think about that when I'm going in. The characters will reveal who they are to me. I'm confident about that, which is why not every single short story is queer characters. I have a bunch of them that are just straight characters, or it doesn't get into that. Because it's just, they'll tell me who they are.
Yeah, exactly.
It just happens to be that most of the time they're queer because that's just my worldview. That's my perspective.
And anecdotally, I remember when I first started writing and started explaining what I wanted to write to friends. Uh,
That must have been fun.
yeah, I know. I remember I once spent quite a long time explaining to my then boyfriend the plot of something that I was writing, and the main relationship was a queer male relationship, and I kept reducing the pronouns to E. So E does this, and then E does this, and then E does this. After a while, he was like, "Who are you talking about now?" It's like, Gemma, is this two guys? Because you can say that, or you could just use their names. That would also be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is that self-censoring impulse, that thing of, it's like, yeah, all right, I'm gonna write it the way I want to do it the first time round, and then I'm gonna translate it.
Right.
Apply straightness.
Yeah, I just can't. I did that once. I can't do it anymore. I couldn't do it after that.
Good. I'm glad.
So you recently, because the Possession of Natalie Glasgow has recently been withdrawn, and it's due to come out again at some point in the future. Is that going to be a different version with some material that you sort of originally suppressed, put back in there, or?
Unfortunately, I don't have any of that material anymore. I'm like a single draft, not single draft as in I only draft it once, but I only work on the same, I kind of work from the same document.
So
at least at that time I did. So I don't really have any of that. I would have to end up like writing new stuff into the text, and I'm not sure if I want to do that. I'm trying to see if the publisher would want to do additional material, like there were like a short story with the novella or something, or a couple, but I'm not sure if they want to do that, or if they just want to like release the novella again. So
Yeah.
we'll have to see. It's not going to be for a long time yet. It's probably not till 2024. So we're still figuring things out.
You got some distance.
Right.
Yeah. Plenty of other stuff coming out between now and then.
Yeah, it's honestly, I have to write everything down, because otherwise I lose track, because I've got like 3 books coming out next year, and already a couple things slated for 2024.
Wow.
Damn you. No, I mean, yeah,
if we didn't like you so much, we'd hate you.
Seriously. You're one of those people who, when I look at your work ethic and your ability to just focus, there is that part of me that's like, yeah, I'm just going to pin her down and eat her brain. Just a bit. Just a little bit of your brain. You don't mind it.
I think that was a compliment.
There might be side effects.
That's fine with me.
I will say, like, I have 3 books coming out next year, but if you look at, like, compare that to like somebody who's got 1 book, a lot of times that 1 book word count wise is the same as those 3 books.
Right.
So you kind of have to, and also it's just that I don't always control, like one of those books I wrote in 2020, another I wrote in 2021, and another I wrote in 2022, but they're all coming out in 2023.
Right.
So it's just like publishing is weird that way. Time does not exist in a proper way. Everything will be sitting on somebody's desk for 6 months, and all of a sudden you have to hurry up and edit it because it's going out the door in like next season.
Yep.
So it's just like, it's impossible to tell. So it ends up looking like, wow, she just like cranked these out over the summer, I guess. But it's like, that's not the case. It's just that.
Pulling
right.
the whole books out of her body, out of some orifice somewhere.
It just ends up looking that way. So like, I'll have like I'll have multiple short stories coming out with a month. And it's like, and I think there's some people who really think like, oh, you just wrote those. And it's like, no, the submission call was like in 2019 or something. Like, yeah. I just can't control when stuff is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Publishing has basically 2 speeds: dead stop and warp factor 4. There's not really, there's not really much in between.
Yep, that is absolutely true.
But yeah, the advantage of that, yeah, if you have got a bit of a, if you've built up a bit of a bottom drawer of stuff that people weren't interested in before, suddenly like, oh, what else have you got? Oh, well, yes, we'll have that. Yeah. If you're lucky.
I mean, some of it's just been like, I sent this to the editor, like in like 2 years ago, and it's just like, oh yeah, we read that, we liked it, and I'm just like, when was this? And then other stuff is like, okay, we're on it right now. It's happening.
Yes.
So it's just like it's not even just that publishing does that. It's like between different publishers, you have no idea what to expect. And I think that's some of the publishing advice that doesn't get passed around enough. That you just, so much of it is not in your control. Like I say that with those 3 releases, no release dates have been announced.
Yep.
It is one of these things. I mean, the only thing you can control is continuing to try and produce material, and of course, there are very long periods. It'll go out. Your stuff goes out there, and there's no reply.
Right, which is that's one of those things where instead of refreshing the inbox, you really got to just start working on something else. Even if it's not something that you're even going to publish, it at least keeps you occupied and keeps you fresh. Like I have so many deadlines. I said this on Twitter and on Instagram. I have so many deadlines coming up, like clustered together, that it's like got me so nerve-wracked that I ended up just spending this whole week writing a story that's not for any of them.
Yeah.
I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, but it was me blowing off steam and doing something for myself. And I think everyone needs to remember that we start off doing these things for fun because we enjoy it. And if you're not enjoying it, then something's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's all we've got time for tonight. But if you tune in next Thursday, you can catch the second part of our interview with Hailey Piper here on No Darkness But Ours.